that van with 3 FBI agents listening in on some informant who's trying to get some guy to say something incriminating, and all he wants to do is play, FIFA on Xbox, and I'm sure that's happened, right? It only stands to reason that it's happened, but we don't get those numbers. I mean, what we do get, and a lot of this requires some extrapolation, but I mean, this is probably interesting to note that after 9/11, the budgets for the FBI changed dramatically. Congress sets the FBI's budget. Prior to 9/11, they didn't allocate a lot of money toward counterterrorism. Most of it went to the areas that I think people typically think of FBI inquiry, like organized crime and financial fraud. After 9/11, that was all turned upside down, and now counterterrorism is the largest funded part of the FBI. It's, they receive $3 billion every year for counterterrorism. And so they have tons and tons of resources around the country. And, there is that question of, because they don't break down how that money is spent, there certainly is, reason to believe there are a lot of cases that they pursue that just don't go anywhere. Part of that you could say, well, that's their job. They have to find out who's dangerous and who's not. And I think you could kind of justify it to some degree by saying that. But I think kind of more troubling is that it indicates that the type of people they're ultimately investigating are of such low capacity that they are likely often kind of like finding themselves, gathering material as like 2 guys are playing Xbox and one of them is mentally ill and neither goes anywhere with the plot and they eventually have to shut it down. But you're right. I mean, I think, years from now when we can get a lot of these FOIA documents, it'd be interesting to see what the FBI was up to in the cases that were not made public.
Yeah, because even in some of the cases that you do hear about in the news, like there were some guys here they busted in Vegas who were like those sovereign guys,
the sovereign citizens.
Yeah, sovereign citizens. And they were sitting around talking about that they were going to make arrests of police officers and keep them in a jail that they were going to build in their basement. Start making arrests. And they got arrested for this, just crazy talk.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there is – in all of these cases that I read about, I mean, this is kind of the interesting thing, and a lot of this has to do with kind of the history of U.S. conspiracy law, which we owe in part to the Clinton administration. But, I mean, what's so amazing about U.S. conspiracy law, especially as it compares to kind of similar applications in other parts of the world, particularly in Western Europe, is that under conspiracy law, it doesn't really matter that you weren't conspiring with someone who wasn't a government agent. Like in these cases, when they charge someone with conspiracy to provide material support to a terrorist organization, they aren't actually in contact with a terrorist organization, right? Like they aren't in contact with Al-Qaeda or Jaish-e-Mohammed or whatever group the FBI was posing to be a part of. But under conspiracy law, in the U.S., it doesn't matter that they weren't actually in contact with the group that they're being charged with supporting. It only matters that they thought they were in contact with them, and that's what we see with these cases. Essentially, is that people are charged in conspiring for organizations that they never even contacted or knew how to contact. It was basically the government being a front for these organizations. And so, in a lot of the conspiracy cases, I think, there's a reasonable question to ask is like, well, would he have actually done anything or was this just talk? I mean, I think all of us at some point, everyone's kind of been around and joked and watched a movie about like a bank robbery and thought, we could do that, right? We could probably pull this off if we researched it well enough. But, most likely, and I speak by myself, certainly if I'm having a conversation like that, it's because I'm sharing beers and we're just, gossiping about how we might do it, right? But I have no interest in actually doing it. And so I think there's a question in a lot of these cases of how much of this is bluster and talk and how much of this is really language that would result in any kind of action.
Yeah, it's kind of frightening when you think about it, So let me ask you another question, because you said you concentrated mostly on cases after 9/11. I just did a show last week, and a couple of shows I've done about the anthrax case. Have you taken a look at that?
No, I mean, I know about it from media reports, but I don't know a lot about, about what happened during that case. I mean, most of what I've been looking at is specifically the FBI's use of stings. So the anthrax case, I know about it in a general way from reading about it, but I don't have any kind of expertise on it.
Okay, great. Now what about the Boston bombing case? That seems to be another bizarre tale of these two guys. They're Chechens, and Russia warns us about them. The KGB's warning us about these two guys, and they're visited by the FBI. And then they got an uncle who's an obvious character, up to something. Then you got FBI agents falling out of helicopters and people getting shot. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, the Boston case was really fascinating. I mean, to me, for a couple of reasons. I mean, there was what happened in Boston prior to the bombing and the intelligence failures, and then after there was this really interesting incident where a friend of Tamlin Tsarnaev's, a man named Ibrahim Todashev, was shot and killed by the FBI agent in Orlando. But what I think is most interesting about the Boston case is that, the Boston case happened about a year after my book was originally published. And a part of, my questioning in the book is, what does the FBI miss by concentrating so enormously on these sting operations involving targets of really dubious threat. And we never really had a clear answer on that. I mean, you can always make the argument anecdotally that obviously the FBI, by concentrating so much on these stings and spending so much money on these stings, is missing something, right? You could point anecdotally and say, well, look at the financial collapse of 2009. So much of that was predicated on the use of fraudulent mortgages and bundlings of bad securities, the types of things that the FBI prior to 9/11 spent a lot of time investigating. And can we kind of offer as a hypothesis that the FBI would have been able to stop this to some degree had it not been so preoccupied with counterterrorism and stings, right? But that's still a very kind of academic question. What was so interesting about the Boston case, in my view, was that it actually showed for the first time that the FBI may be missing, truly dangerous threats as a result of its preoccupation with sting targets. And what happened was in January 2011, what we know is that from the FBI's admissions after the Boston Marathon bombings is that the Russian intelligence services contacted the Boston office of the FBI and said, hey, look, we're really concerned about this Tamlin Tsarnaev. We think he's connected to some groups in Dagestan and Chechnya, and we think he possibly is radicalized and dangerous. The FBI says they send out an agent, they did a threat assessment, and they came to the view that Tamerlan wasn't dangerous, so much so that he was able to travel later to Dagestan without the FBI or any American intelligence agencies really raising an eyebrow. But that same month that the Russian officials contacted the Boston FBI field office, the same field office in Boston had an informant who was known as Khalil, and Khalil had a heroin addiction that he was hiding from the FBI. And what we know is that he was looking to make some extra money, and he goes to the FBI and says, hey, I met this guy named Rezwan Firdaus, and Firdaus, he says he wants to bomb the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And Rezwan was a guy who had recently graduated from Northeastern University, but also had a recent history of mental illness. In fact, his family was trying to get him help. His situation had kind of grown so bad that by the time the FBI sting on him began, Rezwan was wearing a diaper just because he couldn't control his own bowels at that point. And so here the FBI has a choice, right? They could look at this guy, Tamlin Tsarnaev, who the Russian officials say could be dangerous, or they could, spend time setting up this guy Rezwan Firdaus, who a heroin-addicted informant says. And amazingly, they chose Rezwan Firdaus, and for 9 months they put together this elaborate sting on Rezwan, where they rented a storage facility. They introduced him to someone that they said was affiliated with terrorist groups. They gave him money to buy a model airplane that he would then use to fly into the gold dome of the Capitol and detonate it with grenades on its wings. They even gave him money to go to Washington, D.C. to scout out locations from where to launch the plane, all, while being filmed by agents. And then finally, when they deliver C4 or what is supposed to be C4. They arrest him and charge him with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction to attack the Gold Dome. And he pleads guilty, and I think he's serving 17 years in prison now. But here's a guy who, on his own, wasn't dangerous were it not for the FBI providing the means and opportunity for him to get involved in a plot. I mean, in fact, as I said, he was suffering from mental illness. He was wearing a diaper. He isn't exactly the guy you'd expect to be, moving forward in a terror plot on his own. And yet that's an example of where the FBI concentrated a lot of effort at a time when they were missing Tamlin Tsarnaev as a threat. What I can't say with any certainty is that had they not done that, they would have captured Tamlin Tsarnaev. I don't have a crystal ball in that sense, but certainly I think it's worth discussing whether cases like Rezwan Firdaus's are distracting the FBI from catching truly dangerous people. And certainly the case in Boston, gives us a really kind of tragic example of someone that we did miss that I think possibly we could have caught or had the opportunity to spend more time on were the FBI not so obsessed with, catching the low-hanging fruit and being able to announce to the public, like, hey, here's another terrorist that we've captured.
But or at least, after we had the pictures of these two brothers plastered all over TV, how come the FBI agent who interviewed them did not say, hey, I remember them. They were right around the corner from where the bomb went off. I've been to their house. I went to their apartment. We didn't even have that.
Right. It's quite amazing, right? I mean, there were, 24, 36 hours after the bombing where we did not have a clear defendant. And it is, to the point that they had to post those photos once they got them and say, like, if anyone knows these people, it's pretty amazing. And again, I think it gets to, obviously FBI agents are fallible just like we all are. It is a very difficult job. I think that's a good kind of caveat to offer in any kind of criticism. At the same time, this is an example of where perhaps we are, as an organization, the FBI is dealing with so much intelligence that it isn't able to kind of sort through it very effectively. One of the things, there's a former FBI agent who's now who works with NYU named Michael German. And one of the things that Michael German has been very critical about is this idea that like nothing goes unturned. So if you get a call at the FBI and you are told that this guy is potentially dangerous, all leads have to be looked at under the FBI's current policies. And so what you're having is a lot of FBI agents chasing down leads and tips about people that are probably not dangerous at all, but because of this kind of never again, no lead goes uncovered policy, the FBI agents are spending a lot of time meeting a lot of people and creating a lot of reports and intelligence that ultimately isn't being used effectively, and is kind of creating such a volume of data and intelligence that I think it's more and more difficult for the FBI to sort through it. And so kind of under that circumstance, it's not shocking to me that you'd have a situation where Tamlin Tsarnaev would have been interviewed by an FBI agent 3 years ago. They'd have a file on him, and yet these pictures come through the field office of like the one person we need to catch as soon as possible, and everyone at the field office is like, well, who? Well, like who's this guy? And I think that's as crazy as that is, it's definitely a symptom of how the FBI currently operates.
Because you're an investigator. I'm an investigator. And if you interview someone, even if it is 3 years ago, and a bombing goes off around that guy's corner, and you're looking for a bomber, you might want to go through your old notes and take a look and see, wouldn't it kind of ring a bell for you?
No, I know. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's not. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
It definitely is, and it certainly doesn't give you a lot of confidence of the organization in general that were this to happen again, where they get a lead on someone who might be dangerous, that it's not going to be buried in a file and no one's ever going to remember him again. It's certainly. I think I think it's hard for the FBI in some ways because they kind of get it both ways. If they get it from people like me who say, well, they're catching people who are dubious and aren't capable of violence on their own. But then when they have the intelligence failures for real threats like Tsarnaev, they get it from other people saying, well, why didn't you catch him? Like, how did this failure happen? And I think the answer is somewhere, in between those two, which is that, they are often distracted by cases that are not of the importance that they give them. And at the same time, they are buried in such a volume of intelligence and, such an onerous, like, I'm an FBI agent and I just had to interview 5 people and do a threat assessment